Welcome everyone. I'm, for those who don't know me, Adrian Brown's Honorary Research Fellow at the Institute, and here because this is a very rare occasion, but it's one of my own professional tribe who's going to be talking to us this evening. It's a huge honour and pleasure to welcome Susan Hattis-Freeman, who is the Philip Resnick Professor of Forensic Psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio, and Director of the Forensic Psychiatry Services at University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center. Susan has the unusual distinction of being a specialist in both forensic psychiatry and perinatal psychiatry. She's widely published and has received numerous awards for her work, including from the American Psychiatric Association, for her research, which has largely been at the interface of women's mental health and forensic psychiatry. She's also the current president of the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, which is the major professional organization for forensic psychiatrists in North America. She's not only one of the most distinguished forensic psychiatrists in the USA, but also multi-talented in all sorts of other areas. An accomplished jazz musician, an accomplished writer in domains outside forensic psychiatry, and indeed is in Cambridge at the moment because she's currently undertaking an MSc in crime and thriller writing in the university, in the course based out at Madingley Hall. And it's particularly nice that a number of her fellow students from the MSc course have joined us as well. So thank you very much for coming and for being here. Susan's title is Child Murder by Mothers, Clinical and Legal Considerations. And Susan, welcome and thank you so much for contributing.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Adrian, for the lovely introduction. So yes, I'm talking about the topic of child murder by mothers this evening. So first, to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to go through definitions of different types of child murder by parents, and then we'll delve into the motives, why mothers kill, why fathers kill. We'll talk specifically about neonaticide, murder in the first day of life, and we'll talk about some ideas for prevention in the States and in Europe as well. We'll talk about infanticide and filicide, killing of the older child. We'll talk briefly about the intersection between child murder and taking one's own life. We'll talk briefly about insanity law and how it relates to child murder. And then finally, we'll focus briefly on infanticide acts, which occur in the UK and in 24 other countries around the world, but not the US where I'm from. So first, the definitions. Filicide is anytime a parent murders a child. In general, we think of this as the child being under age 18, when they're still at home, still dependent on the parents, although it can happen at later ages as well. Neonaticide is a very specific type of child murder by the parents. Its very own distinct characteristics, and it's really within that first day of life and usually the first hour of life. Infanticide is a term I will use. It's used in law. It's a little bit of a messier term. It meant one thing in biblical times. It in general means child murder under age 1, though depending on location, for example, in Australia, parts of Australia, it's up to age 2. In New Zealand, it's up to age 10. And here are a couple of the cases that we'll be considering this evening. These are the children of Susan Smith on the left side, who were killed, and the children of Andrea Yates on the right side. Okay, the fairy tales we grew up with, if you remember, they include evil stepmothers, almost always evil stepmothers. Think of Snow White, Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel. And in the current day, we often see more stepfathers killing their stepchildren than stepmothers. But the thinking is that in days of yore, when fairy tales were coming about, there were higher rates of maternal mortality, so mothers dying, so children were more likely to have stepmothers at that time than they are now. And therefore killing by stepmothers was more common. Looking to the animal kingdom, Daly and Wilson were evolutionary biologists who looked at anthropologically what are the reasons for animals killing one's children, and then of course for humans. First, scarce resources in the animal kingdom, then also poor quality offspring. So if this offspring wasn't going to be able to travel with the herd, for example. Paternal uncertainty is another reason, and we'll talk about this more. And then, of course, coercion. Now, talking about fairy tales, there's even a term coined by Wilson and Daly, the Cinderella effect. And this is that idea that a stepchild's risk is elevated many times over, orders of magnitude, because of being a stepchild and being killed by the non-biological parent. There was also a 16th century French proverb looking into this: the mother of babes who elects to re-wed has taken the enemy into her bed. So next I want to turn to the motives. And the motives were originally described by my mentor, Phil Resnick, in the 1960s. And he reviewed the world literature at that time and described 5 different motives why mothers or fathers might kill. So these are motives for either mothers or fathers killing their child. And I'm going to go through each of these individually in detail, but these include what was known as accidental, which we would currently call fatal maltreatment. It includes cases of unwanted children, cases of the Medea syndrome or partner revenge, then altruistic killings, and killings while the parent is acutely psychotic. So first, to look at what he called at that time accidental, which I'm saying we should call fatal maltreatment. Now, he initially described it as an accident because the parent didn't plan in advance to kill the child in this case. However, it is not an accident like we would usually think of an accident, that someone accidentally falling down the stairs. It's actually an obvious consequence of certain specific behaviors. So these accidental cases are the most common cases, the fatal maltreatment cases, and this is the child who has a history of chronic abuse or chronic neglect. And then one day it's the eventual neglect or the eventual abuse that kills them. The most common mechanism of this death is head trauma. Now, it could be a one-off. It could be a child who is abused just once. The parent is playing video games, the small child gets in the way and gets thrown out of the way and has a head injury. More often, it's chronic abuse. The fatal neglect cases, again, more often fatal neglect, chronic neglect. However, it could be, for example, say a parent has a drug problem, they're a single parent, they're going to leave their baby home alone just for a few minutes while they go out to score some drugs, but then they end up spending the weekend using drugs and the child has succumbed in their crib during that time, and that might be a one-off event as well. I also have Munchausen syndrome by proxy on this slide, also known as factitious disorder by proxy. This is a very small number of these cases. And just to review, Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when the parent, the vast majority of times the mother, is appearing to make the child ill or physically making the child ill in order to gain attention for herself about what a long-suffering, wonderful mother she is. So in those cases, again, she's usually not planning to kill the child because then she's going to stop getting all the attention for taking care of this sick child. But depending on what she's doing related to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, is she, injecting insulin, injecting feces or pathogens into the child to make them appear unwell, it may kill the child. And again, this term accidental, but it's an expectable consequence. Now, what's some of the data? This is American data from the National Reporting System. And you would think, where's Child Protective Services in this, the Department of Human Services? The thing is, it's a little like looking for a needle in a haystack. So if there are 2 deaths per 100,000 kids, there's actually 471 referrals to Child Protective Services per 100,000 kids. So that's already a needle in a haystack. But then the bottom statistic I have there, the minority of children who die of maltreatment actually had Child Protective Services involved previously. And so it's very difficult for Child Protective Services to find these kids in advance. The other point I have on this slide is the age of the children. While children of any age may be killed by their parents, it's often the younger children who we're not seeing at daycare or preschool, we're not seeing at school age events, and therefore we're not picking up things in advance. Now the next slide shows when a child is killed by fatal child maltreatment, who did it? And so you see there's a chunk on the right side of the mother acting alone, then there's the father acting alone, parents acting together. This parents unknown might surprise you at first, but when you think about it, what it is, and I sit on a fatality review team as well, sometimes it's difficult to figure out which parent did it. The two parents were home alone with the child, both of them are denying anything. You know it was one of them, but you don't know which one. It can be non-parent caretakers, the nanny, the daycare, the babysitter, et cetera as well. So when we think about motivation and we're thinking about prevention of this sort of child murder by parents, it's often born out of anger and frustration at the child. So often the parent asserts that they have been disciplining the child. I have that in quotes because often there's a poor understanding of what the child should be doing at that age, and so they say that they were disciplining a much younger child than should be disciplined, and obviously in a much more physical manner than they should be. Poor parenting skills, in some cases, substance abuse, in some cases, they're acutely mentally unwell. And so the mechanisms that we have at present are the reporting to Child Protective Services, and then child fatality review teams, which exist around the world, looking into each individual case with the various services represented, Child Protective Services, the prosecutor, the police, the EMS, the psychiatry, the pediatrics, looking into how could we have prevented this better. The second motive is the motive of an unwanted child. The parent who kills an unwanted child sees the child as a hindrance rather than as a person. It's a hindrance to the money they plan to get, to the move or relationship they plan to have. An unwanted child is the most common motive when there's a neonaticide case, that murder in the first day of life, which we'll explore a lot more. The third motive, the least common, is partner revenge or Medea syndrome. And if you recall your mythology, Medea's partner, Jason, had cheated on her. And so to get back at him, she killed their children. And when we think about these cases in the modern day, we're often thinking about in the middle of a difficult custody battle, one parent killing the children to get back at the other parent, or if I don't get the custody, you're not going to see them either. The parent may kill all of the children in these Medea syndrome cases, or they may kill one. If they kill one child, they're going to kill the child who is the favorite child of the parent who they're trying to hurt emotionally. And then the last two are the more psychiatric motives, altruistic and acutely psychotic. So altruistic murder, how can homicide be a murder out of love? Well, we've spent a lot of time trying to further categorize this. And in our work, what we found is several distinct groups. So some parents who are killing as part of an extended suicide, and others who believe that their child is suffering and they're trying to prevent that. So in the extended suicide cases, this is a depressed parent who very much loves their child. They're depressed and suicidal themselves, and they think about, if I commit suicide, who's going to take care of this child? They're going to have a worse life. They're not even going to have a parent. So because I love them, I'm going to kill them and kill myself. As a forensic psychiatrist, I see these cases when the parent has succeeded in killing their child, but did not die from that act themselves. And then altruistic to relieve suffering. It could be real suffering or psychotic belief that they're suffering. So when it's real suffering, what we often see is a parent who's depressed, their child has an awful diagnosis, leukemia, cerebral palsy, something like that. The parent foresees that the child is going to have a really difficult life, and the parent comes to believe that the most loving thing to do is to kill that child in an easy way so that they won't suffer. Now, the psychotic cases of altruistic filicide go like this. A parent with schizophrenia or psychotic disorder, so they're out of touch with reality. Common things that I hear or that we see in our research is the parent truly believes a fate worse than death is going to happen to the child. So the child they believe is going to be kidnapped and sold into sexual slavery. And so they think I'm doing the right thing by killing them before that can happen. Okay. And then the fifth motive that Resnick described in the 60s, he referred to as acutely psychotic, not to be confused with the last one, but this is often when there's a deific decree. The person believes they heard the voice of God telling them to kill their child. So they were psychotic at the time, hearing voices at the time. Okay, now I want to tell you a story about a case that's an altruistic filicide, and you may remember this case. I was a trainee at the time in the early 2000s and traveled to Texas when my mentor was working on the case. So Miss Yates drowned her 5 children. The youngest is not in this picture. They were 4 months old to 7 years old at the time. She was previously trained as a nurse and was a stay-at-home mom at the time of the murders. She was suffering from postpartum psychosis, so she was experiencing postpartum psychotic symptoms such as voices, delusional thinking, fixed beliefs out of touch with reality. She had a lengthy history of psychiatric hospitalizations and psychiatric treatment. Her family was also deeply religious in a sort of new religion that was somewhat cult-like, and they took the Bible quite literally in that religion. So an eye for an eye kind of thing that is not that common in religion these days. So because she took the Bible literally, one of their beliefs was that once a child was 7 years old, they could have moral responsibility for their actions, and they were old enough to therefore be able to perish in the fires of hell if they died after age 7 and were on a bad path. And part of her delusional thinking was that she was a terrible mother, and her delusions developed to the point where she actually truly believed that she was the one true Satan. And so imagine she's a smart lady, she's got these different delusional thoughts going through her mind, and she figured that the loving thing to do was to kill her children now while they were still young to prevent them from perishing in the fires of hell for eternity. She had thought it through further than that. She believed that she was the one true Satan, and also knew about the death penalty in Texas where she lived. And so she figured she would get the death penalty, Satan would be killed, and the world would therefore be saved as well. So this was her psychotic reasoning at the time, and it was an altruistic murder because it was out of love that she was killing her children. And how it happened is she drowned each of them in the bath at home. Now her family did know that she was mentally unwell. They had a plan in place. So while the husband went to work, the mother-in-law would come and be with her and the children. During like the rush hour time, there would be about a half an hour where she was alone with the children while her mother and husband were in cross traffic. And that's when she killed the children. She had a first trial in which she was found guilty, and then a retrial in which she was found insane, and then forensically hospitalized subsequently. And then here's another case of filicide. This was an earlier case from the 90s. Before I was a forensic psychiatrist, when I was just a young mom, and we saw Susan Smith and her husband, David, on the news and breaking into your television programs to talk about what had happened and could someone please return their children. So Susan Smith said that she had been at a deserted traffic light when a Black man had carjacked her. she went on national television with her estranged husband, begging that this Black man, he can keep the car, just return the 2 boys who were strapped in car seats in the back seat. This was a scary thing to hear on the news as a young mother. And it definitely made me lock the doors of my car when I was driving. They eventually broke the case open when they realized that the traffic light that she was at, which she said was deserted, actually only would turn red if there was opposing traffic. So it was one of those lights that depended on other cars waiting to go. She then admitted that she had driven to the lake and pushed the car into the lake with the boys in the back. Now, she claimed an altruistic motive. She claimed that she was suicidal, and she did have a history of trauma and depression. Claimed that she was suicidal. She was going to drive into the lake with the boys and end it for the 3 of them, that it was an extended suicide like we were talking about. Prosecutors argued a different motive. Prosecutors argued the unwanted child motive. She had been seeing the local rich man in town, the factory owner, and she was hoping for marriage, but he told her he couldn't marry someone who already had children, and he couldn't raise another man's children. And she got a lengthy prison sentence. Okay. Next, I want to turn to neonaticide, which is murder in the first day of life. And a famous case of that was also from the 90s. And this is Melissa Drexler. She was nicknamed by the American media the prom mom. And she got this name because she actually delivered at the annual high school ball. The prom literally gave birth in the bathroom at the ball. And what happened in her case is a strand we'll see through neonaticide cases in general. They found the baby. They didn't know whose baby it was because these are often hidden pregnancies. And eventually it was found that it was her pregnancy. But also think about the people who find these neonaticides are often like the janitor, et cetera, finding a heavy trash bag. So neonaticide, all of us were at highest risk of being murdered on the first day of life. It's estimated that it's about 2 out of 100,000 newborns, but the rates are really underestimated. If you think about it, these are tiny baby bodies, usually hidden pregnancies, so no one's expecting a 6-pound body, and they can be hidden a great many places. There's also an issue sometimes with coroner rulings, depending on the state of the body when it's found. Can they tell if the baby was born alive or stillborn, etc.? Another recent American case was in the New York City, actually Herald Square, Victoria's Secret. And a young woman was caught shoplifting. They took her to the back to look through her bag to see what all Victoria's Secret items she had stolen. And indeed, there was a dead baby. And so perhaps easier to cover up in a rural location than a busy city location as far as burying the body. So as far as neonaticide, we looked into the world literature on neonaticide and in the developed world. There are some differences in places where it's more valuable to have a son, expected more valuable to be a son. So there are some places with female-specific neonaticide. But in the rest of the world, what we tend to find about perpetrators is it's a young single woman. She almost always is acting alone at the time of the murder. She may have had a one-night stand or a short-term relationship or incest, etc. And she is very alone at the time of the murder usually. She's relatively young. She's often, though not always, of a lower socioeconomic status. She usually lives with her parents, and she has not gotten prenatal care for this pregnancy because this is a hidden pregnancy. There's often denial or concealment of pregnancy, which we'll go into much more detail about in a second. She's afraid of the repercussions of being pregnant. She's afraid of getting kicked out of the house, the community, the religion, etc. And there's very often a lack of pre-morbid serious mental illness. We'll talk about some cases where there is serious mental illness, but in general, when we as a forensic psychiatrist are asked to evaluate her, she might be depressed at that time or anxious at that time. after the murder, but part of what we need to do is figure out what her mental state at the time of the offending was. Now, interestingly, there is a study where a third of these women had another child. So it's not always that people couldn't have recognized that they were pregnant, et cetera. And I will say that the data that we have is about people who have been caught. And when we're talking about how easy it is to cover up a neonaticide, I think we only have a chunk of the data. Okay, what is denial of pregnancy? So Laura Miller described 3 types of denial of pregnancy, and we did some work to further categorize those. So the first type is pervasive denial. That's the type that you see on a talk show where the woman says, I had no idea I was pregnant, I thought I had to go to the toilet, and there was a baby. So in those pervasive cases, it's completely out of her mind. She does not realize that she's pregnant. There's no emotional awareness. Some of these women, they continue to have some bleeding, so they convince themselves I'm still having my period, et cetera. And that's different from affective denial, where these women have some intellectual awareness, but they're pushing it out of their head. A quote from our study was like, I couldn't be pregnant. Not that I'm not, I can't be. And then the third and rarest type is psychotic denial. And this is a woman with schizophrenia who intermittently does not acknowledge that she's pregnant. It's correlated with custody loss, and it kind of makes sense as a defense mechanism too, because if you have a severe mental illness, and even if you wanted to bond with this baby growing inside you, if you know you're going to lose custody, it might be protective that you're denying that it exists. These occur on a spectrum and can also occur on a spectrum with concealment of pregnancy. Here's, you can even have twins when you think you just had to go to the toilet. And so, yeah, it's teenagers, but we've also had cases of denial of pregnancy where it's older women. So a 45-year-old thinks she's going through the change of life, but really it was a pregnancy, and that's why she's gained weight and stopped having her periods. So it's not just only teenagers. Now, concealment of pregnancy is, again, along this spectrum. It can occur after denial, and perhaps you've been in denial all this time, but then you just can't deny it any longer at a certain point in some women. So this is a knowledge of pregnancy purposely hidden from others. Now, certainly not all of these women kill their baby. A lot of them make some sort of recognition, go to the hospital, have the baby, or have the baby at home. But some of them in our work are presenting to the hospital for reasons like abdominal pain, but it turns out that's contractions, and that they didn't have awareness of why they were having this abdominal pain. Or a woman with seizures, which is the end result of some problems in pregnancy obstetrically, but they're presenting with seizures instead of presenting with late pregnancy. So in some women, there's quite significant denial. And of course, the risk of not getting any prenatal care. This is just a little sub-point, is that there are occasionally psychotic women who kill their children in the first day of life. They tend to be a different population. They did get prenatal care. They might have older children, and they were psychotic at the time, but that's a very small group. Interestingly, in Japan, there are 2 different words for neonaticide, and one of the words means thinning out. So because of poverty, couples, women with older children who kill their child that they can't take care of, versus the type called anomie, which is similar to what I've been describing around the world. Now, Japan has a really interesting prevention story. What women in Japan would do in the 1970s if they were committing neonaticide, killing their baby, they would, the train station lockers were in the basements of train stations, and you could put a baby body in a train locker and be in another city, within an hour or whatever. And again, they still weren't able to identify these babies and whose mothers they were. This will change with DNA technology and 23andMe and all of that. But in the 70s, couldn't do that. So what they did is they publicized the problem. They made the lockers more visible. Now, if you go to a Japanese train station, they're upstairs right next to where you're catching the trains. They increased contraceptive information in a culture that didn't have so much information out there. The problem is you never know exactly if how much it worked, or did someone start thinking of other places to hide the baby bodies that no one knew of? So what we have in the States, there's a safe haven law, and every single state is better than every single other state, so they're different in every state. But in general, you can take the unwanted baby to a hospital, to a police station, to a fire station, depending on what state you live in. And these started coming in the 1990s, actually as a result of those child fatality review boards looking at what things can we do to prevent these deaths. This is a helpful picture on a dumpster describing what to do if pictures work better than words. And then the mother remains anonymous. She has immunity from being prosecuted. Some arguments against are that there's no information about adoption or paternal rights. The other issue, though, is these fathers, as I was saying, usually didn't even know about the pregnancy and weren't involved either. In different parts of the EU, there have been baby hatches for hundreds of years. A modern version is this bottom right-hand corner baby box. That would be a box in the exterior wall of a hospital. You would put your unwanted baby in there. Then some lights go off inside the hospital in the ER, and the baby is picked out of the box. There's also an anonymous birth option in France and one other European country. And in France, it's been around for decades. And that idea is, rather than having these women deliver secretly at home, where anything could go wrong, let's bring them safely into the hospital to deliver. And so you go in, you're Jane Doe when you deliver, or whoever, and then you just leave the baby when you leave the hospital. Problem with that is a lot of these women really don't realize, as I'm saying, that they're about to give birth. And then also, if she's from the lower socioeconomic status or lives rurally, et cetera, how is this 16-year-old going to figure out how to get herself to the hospital to deliver? Turning now to maternal filicide, so mothers who kill children from more than 24 hours of life through usually 18 years. What we know depends a lot on the group that we're looking at. So looking at general population studies, which we did looking internationally, so coroner samples, which would include everybody. Some of the common factors we found are, again, this stressed out mom. She's of a low socioeconomic status. She's the full-time caregiver of this child who she kills, often socially isolated, often a victim herself, and substance abuse may play a role. Now, then if we specifically look at who gets put in a correctional sample, so this is gonna not include the people who committed suicide, this is not gonna include the people with a psychiatric disposition. Again, we see the same sort of thing. She's often a victim herself, substance abuse may occur. And this last point, the child viewed as abnormal. That goes back to what I was saying before. Maybe the child is abnormal, and certainly like a child with a developmental disability, maybe at higher rates of being killed, higher risk. But also what I've found clinically and what the literature describes is mothers who don't really have great parenting knowledge, and they think the child is doing something abnormal, even though it's totally normal, like a colicky baby or a baby crying because they're hungry, but the mother thinks they're just doing it to annoy them. And then this final group of studies, psychiatric studies, so mothers who were found not guilty by reason of insanity or who were found unfit to stand trial and then go to a psychiatric hospital. So no surprise there. This is the group of women who are often psychotic. Delusions often circled around their child, so their beliefs, their fixed false beliefs were focusing on their children. She may be depressed, suicidal. She's often used mental health services before, so this idea of is prevention possible? And then the concept of motherless mothers, which is a little bit psychodynamic, but what the idea is that these women never learned how to be mothers because they lost their own mothers for some reason when they were children. So their own mother died, or their own mother abandoned the family, etc. And you find that actually pretty commonly in this group. So can we predict this? In our research in a forensic population, some mothers saw the psychiatrist within days to weeks before the murders. Some psychiatrists had concerns, others did not. We also found that they often had been seen by the pediatrician or in the ER with worries that turned out to be delusional about their child being unwell, etc. So I thought that might be the magic thing. So I talked to my husband, who's a pediatrician. Is there a way we can find these mothers? It turns out a lot of mothers come with anxious concerns about their child being unwell to the pediatrician, and really difficult to ferret out who's actually delusional about that. A study by my mentor in New Zealand, Sandy Simpson, found among a group of women with a psychiatric disposition that mothers who were psychotic often had no plans in advance of killing the child, but still killed the child, whereas the depressed moms had thought about this for days to weeks prior. Now, what are some potential factors within the child that may elevate their risk? Of course, not their fault, but just things that might elevate their risk when we're thinking about prevention. So having a colicky baby, a child with a developmental disorder, so autism or intellectual disability, and then a serious illness, right? It could be a real illness, like we talked about, like the parents who are killing because they believe they're sparing their child from suffering. It could also be a perceived illness by the parent, a misinterpretation of the illness. Now, the colic itself, this study is very hard to get ethics approval to do, but what they did is they asked moms in the general population, we're not talking about moms with mental illness, just any of us in the general population, and their child has colic. And they say, do you have any thoughts about harming your child? And 70% admitted they had explicit aggressive thoughts and fantasies toward their child with colic. And a quarter said they had infanticidal thoughts during the colic episodes. Colic is a really stressful thing for the child to have, and of course that many parents are not trying to kill their child, but it's just how frequently this is something that people think about. I promised to turn briefly to filicide and suicide's intersection. And overall, if you look at the numbers overall of parents killing their children, in general, they'll slightly vary depending on the study, but in general, moms and dads kill their children at similar rates. So this becomes really interesting, this first statistic on here. 16 to 29% of mothers and 40 to 60% of fathers also kill themselves at the same time. So of course, we know that everyone who commits suicide is not acutely mentally ill, but a large chunk of them are, right? So when we're thinking about what is the intersection of parents who kill their children and themselves, we've got a good number of fathers there. So just implications of mental illness in this population of dads as well. There's also a phenomenon of filicide suicide, where the parent, in that case it's usually the father, kills the children and the wife or partner and themselves. And I have listed some common characteristics there as well. Now, when we looked at filicide suicide in an American coronial sample of 30 parents who had killed their children and themselves, what we found was that altruistic motive was the most common motive. But also we found this child age of 7 on average, and it was, all range of child age, but the average age was 7. And that's similar to what other international studies show, is it's not always the infants like we think of, it's kids of all different ages who are killed. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do briefly is talk about the insanity law, and then we're going to talk about the infanticide laws and think through a little bit about these outcomes for parents. So just to briefly review the insanity law, the rule that's in England and in most of the US is the McNaughton law, and that comes from the 1800s, and that came about after a case where Daniel McNaughton, who I believe was a Scottish woodturner, attempted to kill the prime minister. This was, as you can imagine, quite a trial of the time. There were many experts testifying in that, and out of that came this thinking, the modern thinking about who should not be punished in prison or with the death penalty for an offense. And the idea is, if someone has a mental illness and that mental illness caused them not to know that their act was wrong, then what we should as a society do is treat them rather than punish them. The same way we would punish someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wasn't mentally ill at the time. In the States, as I was saying, the most common is a similar McNaughton rule to the UK. Also, about a third of states have an irresistible impulse component. So if the person was acutely mentally unwell and they had this irresistible impulse to kill, that might qualify as well as the not knowing the wrongfulness of the act. And again, the idea is that if someone believed what they were doing was right at the time, we want to get them treatment, restore their mental health, decrease their violence risk, rather than punish them for a certain amount of time in prison. Now, we looked at parents who kill and the intersection of mental illness and insanity. This was a sample in 2 states, so Ohio and Michigan. And Ohio has the McNaughton rule, and Michigan has the McNaughton plus the irresistible impulse. Now, just a brief comment about gender bias. I wanted to include both fathers and mothers who killed their children and were found not guilty by reason of insanity. I talked about the rates being very similar of fathers and mothers who kill, and there was only one father in both states who had killed and been found not guilty by reason of insanity. So we ended up just doing a study of the mothers. So this is women who killed their children, were subsequently adjudicated insane for the killing. We found that almost 3/4 had previous mental health treatment, half had been previously psychiatrically hospitalized. Around the time of the offending, 2/3 of them were hearing voices, auditory hallucinations. Half of them were depressed at the time of the filicide, of the killing the children. Now, more than half had credibly planned suicide along with the filicide. So how is that number so high? It may be physically easier to kill a child than oneself with the same methods. So an example might be, I'm talking about horrible examples this evening, but a parent who thinks I'm going to kill the children and myself with carbon monoxide, and so runs the car in the garage, and the car runs out of petrol. So the children have already died. She's maybe passed out, and she comes to a few hours later. That sort of thing. Some of these scenes, the mother wakes up, the father wakes up and realizes they haven't died themselves. And so they try another thing and another thing. And these can be some of the messiest police reports that you'll see because of these different ways that they've tried to kill themselves. There was much more common postpartum psychosis in this group. And you can see a lot of them were either pregnant or postpartum. A lot of them had significant developmental stressors, and this is that idea of they were motherless mothers, having lost their own mothers, etc. Now, interestingly, the average age that these moms attacked of their kids was 3.5. If they were sparing the life of a child, they would tend to spare the life of an older child and be killing the younger children. And this was postpartum psychosis in a full 1/4 of the mothers. Now, when we look at the motive, the why, and we use the forensic reports and any evidence from the scene, et cetera, to categorize these, over half of them were these altruistic motives, so murder out of love. We further looked at, were they psychotic at the time, were they out of touch with reality, or were they depressed, et cetera, and most of them were psychotic at the time. Now, you might be surprised when we talked about mental illness causing you not to know the wrongfulness of your acts. How did two children killed by fatal maltreatment, one child killed as an unwanted child, how did those meet the legal criteria of insanity? And it was interesting because there is this gender bias and this belief that a woman couldn't do that. She must be mad if she did that, versus we're much more able as a society to understand this quote unquote evil man who does this, but a woman, a mother, how could she do this? And in fact, the forensic reports did not support the finding of NGRI, and the court went against that. And that is of specific interest as a forensic psychiatry, because it usually goes the other direction. We may be supporting ourselves and NGRI finding, and the court doesn't want to, but it's the opposite in these cases. Okay, which brings us to the Infanticide Act in the UK. This has a really interesting history. The first law that was amended was from 1922. And when you read about the history, it came about related to servant girls who were having a child by their master or the homeowner, and they were in this impossible situation of having gotten pregnant, needing to work, because if they didn't work, there was not a social services system that could help them out. And so they wouldn't be able to provide for the infant if they weren't working. And then they killed the child, found guilty, hanged from the gallows, which perhaps you might be able to trace back to their sexual trauma. So to fix that, one of the things that was done was the Infanticide Act. And there was this outdated concept of lactational insanity, that, there's something about the breastfeeding that makes women insane. But it was more the shame of the unwed mother. Now, the UK Infanticide Act covers children up to 12 months old, and it's still, like a lot of laws, has some outdated language. So we're thinking about her mind being disturbed because she wasn't recovered from delivery or lactation. I'll ask you to think about that as well. So basically, it rather than being murder, then if a woman kills her child under 12 months of age, she might get an infanticide verdict, and it's more akin to manslaughter. Now, after the UK did this, 24 other nations followed. And one interesting case is New Zealand in the Crimes Act 1961. Now, New Zealand didn't say a year, they said a 10-year-old. So if the balance of her mind is still disturbed, she could kill a child of hers up to age 10. She spends a maximum of 3 years in prison, and then there's another special legal way to be acquitted on an account of insanity caused by childbirth. So on the face of it, that sounds like, how could she possibly still be postpartum when her child's age 10? But think back to the Andrea Yates case, where she killed her 6-month-old up to her 7-year-old. If she was in England, for example, then maybe she would qualify for this law with the 6-month-old, but not for the other children, even though her state of mind was the exact same when she was killing all of them. So she would also have the Insanity Act that she could try for, but that's kind of the idea under the New Zealand Crimes Act. Okay, so I would like to say something about what I think some problems with the Infanticide Acts are. There's an inherent gender bias when we think about what are laws that are only for women. Is that moving things forward or not moving things forward? I think about what other laws there are that are only for women. Then there's also kind of the conceptions, if you believe they were what they believed in 1922 and 1938 about postpartum psychiatric disorders, whereas we've come really far since then in understanding mental health issues, and we don't think that lactation makes you insane, etc. Also, when you think about the this act, the Infanticide Act, it would cover the neonaticide cases as well as the children up to age 1. And we've talked about how very different neonaticide tends to be from the other types of child murder. And then the issue that, what about the value of that child's life who was killed? So some of the gender bias then, are we pathologizing childbirth by talking about this lactational insanity, et cetera? And are we not giving the woman agency in the fact that she's done this? Also, how fair is it that we have one law for mothers and another for fathers when we've talked about those 5 motives that they might have, either one of them? And then Stengel talks about this concept that I love, chivalry justice. So is it that it's being chivalrous because this is not how women are supposed to act, so we need this special law for them? Anna Motz is a forensic psychotherapist who has written a book about women and agency and criminality. And she writes, far from considering the decision by a young woman facing social censure, isolation, and emotional upheaval for at least the next 15 years of her life to kill the child to be a rational, if highly unethical decision, it is more palatable to justify this behavior on the grounds of mental instability. So I'll just review a couple things and then open it up for questions and thoughts. We talked about infanticide, filicide. The most common motive is that fatal maltreatment, that often chronic abuse or chronic neglect, some cases of one-off, but the so-called accidental motive where the parent has been abusing or neglecting the child at length. We talked about a different, most common motive for neonaticide, that of an unwanted child. And we have to be careful if we see a new study coming out, was it of a psychiatric population where of course we're going to see psychiatric motives versus if we're looking at a coronial population, we're looking at everyone. So most neonaticides and infanticides do not occur because of maternal mental illness. Certainly may be a factor. There may be substance abuse or other stressors like we've talked about. We talked about men being more likely to commit suicide than women after killing their child. And we talked about that mothers who were found insane often had the altruistic motive and then less commonly the acutely psychotic motive. And I'd love to have some discussion on this. I would argue that an infanticide act requires that we as a society believe that the value of that child's life is less than the value of others' lives, and that a mother, because of her gender, is less culpable than a father. So then in conclusion, we've talked about mental illness is only one piece of this puzzle of child murder by parents. Neonaticide is different. I would say that our prevention strategies are different depending on the different motives, because the parent who chronically abuses, chronically neglects their child often has very different characteristics than the severely depressed mother who kills their child, for example. And then we talked about how appropriate is an infanticide law. Should it exist? Is the New Zealand model the better one because it does cover that mental state longer? Should it be for both genders, all genders? Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to open it to questions.